Welcome to the Scary Collector. I'm glad you're here tonight, or maybe I'm not, because what I'm about to share with you are not stories pulled from the pages of fiction. These are not the imaginations of writers sitting safely at their desks. These are real accounts, real people, real terror. 8 stories collected from the darkest corners of human experience. Police reports, survivor testimonies, court documents, witness statements, and in some cases, the words of people who barely made it out alive to tell the tale. Some of them didn't make it out at all. Before we begin, I want you to do something for me. Get comfortable, maybe turn off a few lights, and listen very, very carefully. Because the thing about true horror is this: it doesn't follow the rules. There's no dramatic music cue to warn you. There's no jump scare you can prepare for. True horror lives in the ordinary moments. The knock at the door at 3 a.m., the footsteps in the hallway that stop just outside your room, the face you see in the window that disappears the moment you look directly at it. True horror is patient. And tonight, it's been waiting for you. Let's begin. Story 1. The Tenant Below. Emily Hartwell was 26 years old when she moved into the second-floor apartment on Caldwell Street in Millbrook, Ohio. It was a quiet town, the kind of place where nothing much happened, where neighbors still waved at each other from their porches, where the worst thing that could occur on any given Tuesday was a stray dog getting into someone's trash. Emily had just taken a job as a medical transcriptionist. She worked from home, which meant long hours alone in the apartment, headphones on, typing the words of doctors and surgeons into neat, organized reports. She was good at her work. She liked the silence. The building had 2 units. Emily was on the second floor. The first floor unit had been empty for 3 months before she moved in. On her 4th night in the apartment, she heard it for the first time. A knock. 3 slow knocks, coming from directly below her bedroom floor. She sat up in bed, heart already moving just a little faster than normal. She listened. Silence. She told herself it was the building settling. Old buildings do that. She'd read that somewhere. She lay back down. 3 more knocks. Slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic. Emily got up and walked to the window. She looked down at the entrance to the first-floor unit. The door was closed. The lights were off. There was no car in the space designated for that apartment. She went back to bed and didn't sleep again until nearly 4 a.m. She mentioned it to her landlord the next day, a man named Gerald, mid-60s, who managed the building from a house about 2 miles away. Gerald told her not to worry. The pipes in the building were old. He said, they knocked sometimes, especially in cold weather. It was October. That made sense to Emily. She accepted the explanation. But the pipes explanation started to fall apart on her 9th night in the apartment. Because this time, the knocking wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from inside her closet. Emily stood in the center of her bedroom, completely still, listening to 3 slow knocks from the other side of her closet door. She was holding her phone. Her thumb hovered over the keypad, ready to dial 911. She told herself she needed to open that door. She told herself there was nothing in there. She had unpacked everything herself. She knew what was in that closet: clothes, boxes, her winter coat. She grabbed an umbrella from beside the door, the closest thing she had to a weapon, and she pulled the closet open. Nothing, just her clothes, her boxes, her winter coat. Emily laughed at herself. She texted her sister about it. Her sister sent back a laughing emoji. Emily went to bed. Over the next 2 weeks, the knocking continued, always in threes, always slow, Never when she was on a phone call or watching something loud. It seemed to come specifically during quiet moments, during the in-between times, when she was just sitting and existing. She began to wonder if she was imagining it. Then, on a Sunday evening in mid-October, Emily came home from grocery shopping to find her front door slightly ajar. She was certain she had locked it. She stood in the hallway, grocery bags in both hands, staring at that 2-inch gap between the door and the frame. Her first thought was that she had simply forgotten to pull it fully shut. Her second thought arrived a moment later, colder and more insistent. Someone opened it. She called Gerald. He came over within the hour, looked around the apartment, found nothing. He suggested she get a chain lock. She ordered one online that night. What Emily did not know, what she would only learn much later, was that the first-floor apartment had not been unoccupied for 3 months. It had been vacated by court order. The previous tenant, a man named Ronald Krebs, age 41, had been served a restraining order by the building's former upstairs resident, a woman in her early 30s who had reported hearing someone moving through her apartment while she slept. She had installed a small camera above her bedroom door. Motion-activated, purchased from a hardware store for $22. The footage from that camera showed Ronald Krebs standing inside her bedroom at 2:17 a.m. on a Wednesday, watching her sleep. He had a key. Gerald had given it to him by mistake during a maintenance mix-up 6 months prior and never realized the error. Krebs was removed from the building. The court order was filed. Gerald, mortified and fearful of liability, told no one about what had happened. He simply listed the unit as vacant and waited for new tenants. He had not changed the locks. Emily discovered all of this not from Gerald, but from the woman who had lived there before her, a woman named Sandra, who tracked Emily down through the building's Facebook listing and sent her a message that began with the words, "Please read this before you spend another night in that apartment." Sandra explained everything: the knocking, which she had also experienced, the feeling of being watched, the door that was sometimes ajar, and the camera footage that had shattered her sense of safety permanently. Emily called the police that same evening. Officers came to the building and discovered, in the storage room directly below Emily's bedroom, evidence that Ronald Krebs had been entering regularly: a folded blanket, an empty water bottle, scratch marks on the inside of a ventilation grate that connected to the crawl space between the first and second floor. He had been listening to her from below every single night. Krebs was arrested 2 days later. He was found living in his car 3 blocks from the building. When police searched the vehicle, they found a notebook filled with detailed observations about Emily's daily routine, her work schedule, what she ate for dinner, what time she went to bed. He had never once knocked on her door, which meant the knocking was something else entirely. To this day, no one has been able to fully explain where that sound came from. Emily moved out the same week. She now lives in a different city. She does not live in apartments. She still sleeps with the lights on. Story 2. The Man in the Photograph. There is a certain kind of horror that lives entirely inside the mind, the horror of knowing something is wrong, but being completely unable to prove it, the horror of looking at something every single day and not seeing what's right in front of you. This is the story of a woman named Diane Pollock. Diane was 43 years old in 2009, living in a mid-sized house on the east side of Louisville with her teenage daughter, Kayla, and a golden retriever named Biscuit. Her husband, Marcus, had passed away 2 years prior from a heart attack. Diane was still grieving, still learning how to be alone, still figuring out what her life looked like now. She kept photos of Marcus everywhere. It was how she coped. Framed pictures on every mantel, every shelf, every wall. Wedding photos, vacation photos, candid shots taken on ordinary days that had become, in retrospect, extraordinary. In February of 2009, Diane decided to have several of these photos reprinted and enlarged. A project she'd been putting off for months. She gathered the originals, brought them to a photo printing shop, and waited while the technician scanned them. The technician, a young man named Trevor, called her over to his screen with an expression she couldn't quite read. He pointed to one of the photos, a candid shot taken at a backyard barbecue, Marcus laughing, paper plate in hand, a crowd of friends behind him. "Is this everyone who was at this party?" Trevor asked. Diane looked at the screen, at the crowd of people behind Marcus, and there, at the edge of the frame, half obscured by the corner of the image, stood a man she did not recognize. He was tall. He was wearing a gray shirt. His face was turned slightly away from the camera, but there was enough of his face visible to tell that he was staring directly at Marcus. Not at the party, not at the crowd. Directly. Marcus. Diane studied the photo. She thought hard. She knew every person who had been at that barbecue. It was held in her sister's backyard. There had been perhaps 15 people. She knew all of them. She did not know this man. She told Trevor that. He nodded, seeming unsatisfied with the answer, and moved on. Diane took her reprints home, but she kept thinking about the photograph. She dug out the original. She had a magnifying glass somewhere. She found it in a kitchen drawer. She sat at the kitchen table and she examined the face of the man in the gray shirt. She still didn't recognize him. She put the photo away. 3 weeks later, she was going through a different box of old pictures. Photos from a trip she and Marcus had taken to the Tennessee mountains 4 years before his death, when something made her stop. A man, gray shirt, face slightly turned, standing behind Marcus on a mountain trail. Diane sat very still for a long time. Then she pulled out every photo album she owned, every box of loose photos, every packet of developed pictures from the last decade. She spread them across the living room floor and she went through them one by one. She found the man in 17 photographs. 17, spanning almost a full decade. Always at the edge of the frame, always slightly obscured, always with his face turned just enough away from the camera that a full identification was impossible. And in every single photograph, he was watching Marcus. Diane brought her findings to the Louisville Metro Police Department. Detectives looked at the photos. They agreed. It appeared to be the same individual in multiple pictures. The gray shirt was not always present. But the build, the posture, the partial facial features were consistent. They opened an inquiry. The investigation uncovered something deeply unsettling. Marcus Pollock, in the 3 years before his death, had reported a stalker to his employer's HR department on 2 separate occasions. He had described a man who seemed to appear at the edges of his life, outside his office building, near his car in parking lots, once standing across the street from his daughter's school. He had never told Diane. He didn't want to frighten her. He had been trying to protect her from something he didn't fully understand himself. Police were never able to identify the man in the photographs. The case remains open. In the years since, Diane has gone back through the 17 photos hundreds of times. In 14 of them, the man's partial face is visible. In 3 of them, his face is almost entirely turned away. In one photograph, taken at Kayla's 8th birthday party, the man is not watching Marcus. He is watching Kayla. Story 3. Knock and wait. Not all horror is subtle. Some of it stands on your porch at midnight and knocks on your door. Daniel and Ruth Calloway lived on a property about 11 miles outside of the small town of Havre, Montana. They were in their early 50s. Daniel was a retired electrician. Ruth taught piano lessons from a small studio attached to the house. They had no children at home. Their youngest had moved to Seattle the previous year. It was late November when it started. The nights were long and very dark out there. The nearest neighbor was almost 2 miles away. The nearest police station was 15 miles. On a Tuesday night, at approximately 11:40 p.m., someone knocked on their front door. This was unusual. People didn't just knock on doors 11 miles outside of town at midnight. Daniel got up. He didn't open the door. He was smart enough not to do that. He looked through the peephole. A man stood on the porch. He was perhaps 30 years old, wearing a light jacket that was completely inadequate for a Montana November. He was not visibly armed. He looked cold. He looked distressed. Daniel spoke through the door. "Can I help you?" The man said his car had broken down. He said he needed to use a phone. Daniel told the man to wait. He went and got his own cell phone and cracked the door, chain still on, and passed it through. He watched the man dial. He watched the man hold the phone to his ear. The man said, "It's not connecting. Can I come in and try your landline?" Daniel said no. He said he could call for help himself. He asked where the car was. The man described a location on the road. Daniel knew the road. It was the only road that led to his property. He said he'd call a tow truck. Daniel closed and locked the door. He turned to Ruth, who had come out of the bedroom. He told her what was happening. He called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. They said they'd send someone out within the hour. Then Daniel looked through the peephole again. The man was still on the porch. He was not moving. He was simply standing there, facing the door, waiting. 40 minutes passed. The man did not move from the porch, did not pace, did not look at his phone, did not sit down. He simply stood there, facing the door, in the freezing cold, perfectly still. Daniel told Ruth to go to the bedroom and lock the door. He got his shotgun from the cabinet. He sat in a chair 15 feet from the front door and waited. At 12:43 a.m., 2 police cruisers pulled up to the property. The man on the porch turned to look at the officers. He raised his hands immediately. He was calm. He was cooperative. He told them exactly what he told Daniel. Broken down car. Needed a phone. Officers drove down the road. They found a car, pulled to the shoulder, with a flat tire. Registration came back clean. The man's ID came back clean. No warrants. One of the officers told Daniel there wasn't much they could do. The man hadn't committed any crime. He was stranded. He needed help. Daniel nodded. He let the officers handle it. The man was given a ride to town. But before the officers left, the more experienced of the 2 pulled Daniel aside. He spoke quietly, out of the man's earshot. "You did the right thing," the officer said, "not opening that door." Daniel asked what he meant. The officer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That car didn't have a flat tire when we found it. It had been parked there deliberately. Someone let the air out of the tire from the outside. It wasn't a blowout. It wasn't a nail. The tire had been deliberately deflated, staged, set up to look like a breakdown." Daniel and Ruth Calloway had been chosen. Their isolated property, their single-access road, their lights on late at night. Someone had done reconnaissance. The man was questioned further at the station. He maintained his story. Police could not hold him. No crime had been committed. He was released. The Callaways installed a full security camera system the following week. Motion-activated lights, a reinforced steel door. They never saw the man again. But here is the detail that haunts Daniel most. When he tells the story, When the officer was walking back to his cruiser, Daniel asked one more question. He asked, "How long do you think he was out there before he knocked?" The officer checked the frost patterns on the porch. The way the man's boots had disturbed the thin layer of ice that forms on wood in a Montana winter. He looked at Daniel and said, "At least 2 hours. 2 hours. Standing in the dark, in the freezing cold, watching the lights in the windows, waiting for the right moment to knock, waiting to see if they were alone." Story 4. The Bones Beneath Garden Hill. Some horrors do not announce themselves. They wait underground. They wait in silence, beneath the ordinary routines of ordinary lives, until someone disturbs the earth just enough to find them. In the spring of 1997, a retired schoolteacher named Helen Marsh purchased a modest home on Garden Hill Road in the outskirts of Stillwater, Oklahoma. The house was pleasant. The yard was generous. Helen, who was 61 and recently widowed, had always wanted a garden. She began in May of that year. She tilled a section of the backyard herself, mixing in fresh soil and fertilizer, preparing rows for tomatoes and peppers and sunflowers. On her third day of tilling, she found a bone. She thought it was an animal bone, a dog, perhaps, or a deer. She set it aside. She kept digging. She found 3 more. She called her son, Michael, who drove over after work. Michael looked at the bones. He was not a doctor, not a scientist. He was an accountant. But he looked at one of the bones for a long time, and then he called the Payne County Sheriff's Office. The bone was human. Forensic teams excavated Helen's backyard over the course of 11 days. In total, they recovered the partial remains of what appeared to be 2 individuals. The remains were heavily fragmented and had clearly been disturbed at some point, whether by animal activity, or by deliberate action. Investigators could not immediately determine. Identification took time. The remains were degraded. Dental records were requested from across the region. The investigation eventually traced the property's history back 20 years to a previous owner named Curtis Ray Donahue, who had lived on Garden Hill Road from 1975 to 1989. Donahue had died in 1993 of natural causes, a heart attack. Alone in a rented room in Tulsa, Donahue had no criminal record. He had been, by all accounts, an unremarkable man, quiet, kept to himself, worked as a mechanic. His neighbors from the 1970s and 1980s, those who could still be located, all said roughly the same thing when interviewed. He was fine, normal, friendly enough. Only one former neighbor, an elderly woman named Pauline, who had lived 2 doors down for most of the 1970s, said something different. She said, "There was a smell. Sometimes, in the summers, we thought it was the trash. We thought it was something dead in the walls." She paused when the detective interviewed her. Then she said, "We always thought it was something dead in the walls." The 2 sets of remains were eventually matched to 2 women who had been reported missing in Payne County in 1978 and 1981, respectively. Both had been in their 20s. Both had last been seen in areas where Donahue was known to have frequented. No charges were ever filed. Donahue was already dead. The case was classified as a homicide investigation but closed without prosecution. Helen Marsh sold the house in 1998. She said she could never look at the backyard the same way again. She said she kept thinking about all the seasons she had almost planted a garden before this one. All the times she'd almost disturbed that ground sooner. The house on Garden Hill Road has changed hands 4 times since then. Currently sits empty. The garden has never been replanted. Story 5. The Night Visitor of Cabin 4. There are places in this world where the dark feels different. thicker, more present, the kind of dark that seems to push back when you try to move through it. The campgrounds of the Six Rivers National Forest in Northern California are, during the day, spectacularly beautiful, towering redwoods, clear streams, the smell of pine and wood smoke. It is the kind of place that looks, in photographs, like a painting. At night, it is something else. In September of 2011, a group of 5 friends rented Cabin 4 at a private campground on the edge of the forest. The group included Marcus, 29, his girlfriend Tessa, 27, their friends Jake, 31, Priya, 28, and Ren, 26. They were there for a long weekend, 4 nights. Starting on a Thursday, the campground had 12 cabins total. In September, off-peak season, only 2 others were occupied. The camp host, a man in his 60s named Pete, lived in a small residence near the entrance. Everything was fine for the first 2 days. On Saturday night, the group had a fire and stayed up late. The last of them went to bed around 2 a.m. The cabin had 2 bedrooms and a main living area. Ren slept on the pull-out couch in the living room because she said she liked being near the fireplace. At approximately 4:15 a.m., Ren woke up. She did not know, at first, what had woken her. She lay still, blinking in the dark, listening. Then she saw it, a shape, outside the cabin's large front window, standing in the dark just beyond the glass, approximately 4 feet from where she lay. Ren described it later as a figure, a person-shaped shadow standing completely still, facing the window, facing her. She could not see a face. The figure was backlit by nothing. The night was overcast. No moon. She could only make out the silhouette. She was completely frozen. Every part of her body said, "Do not move. Do not make a sound." She lay still for what she later estimated was between 5 and 10 minutes, though she said it felt much longer. During that entire time, the figure outside the window did not move. Then, slowly, she reached for her phone on the cushion beside her. She turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window. The figure was gone. Ren woke Marcus and Jake immediately. The 2 men checked outside with flashlights. They found nothing. No footprints were visible. The ground was dry and compacted. They checked the perimeter of the cabin. Nothing. Ren was shaking. She was not a person prone to imagination or panic. She worked as a nurse. She was accustomed to difficult situations. She prided herself on being calm. Everyone who knew her agreed on that point. The others believed her completely. They spent the rest of the night with every light in the cabin on. The next morning, Sunday, they decided to cut the trip short and leave Monday instead of Tuesday. They told Pete, the camp host, what had happened. Pete's response was not what they expected. He did not dismiss it. He did not suggest it was a deer or a shadow. He said, "Was it around 4 in the morning?" Pete then told them something he probably should have disclosed before they rented the cabin. Over the past 3 years, 4 separate groups of guests staying in Cabin 4 specifically had reported the same experience. A figure, standing outside the large front window, approximately 4 in the morning, standing perfectly still, gone the moment a light was turned on. Pete had reported it to the county sheriff twice. Deputies had come out, walked the property, found nothing. They had suggested it might be a local, someone who lived in the forest, someone without a fixed address. It happened in national forests more than people realized. They said, people living deep in the trees. One deputy, on the second visit, had found something about 60 yards into the tree line. He'd found a spot where someone appeared to camp regularly. A cleared area, the remnants of small fires, some discarded food packaging, no person, just evidence of habitation. Whoever it was knew the campground, knew the schedule, knew when guests were asleep, knew which cabin had the big front window. The group left Monday morning. Tessa later said that the worst part wasn't the figure itself. The worst part was the realization that whoever it was had been coming back. Repeatedly. For 3 years, had been standing at that window looking in. Over and over. Watching different groups of strangers sleeping, and in all that time, no one ever saw their face. Story 6. The Confession Letter. This story begins with a letter. In March of 2016, a woman named Carolyn Dietrich received a piece of mail at her apartment in Albany, New York. The envelope had no return address. It had been postmarked from a town about 60 miles away. Her name was written on the outside in neat, careful handwriting. Inside was a single page, handwritten, no signature. The letter read, in part, and I want to be careful here, because the language is disturbing. The letter described, in specific detail, a series of events from Carolyn's daily life, where she went for coffee, what route she walked to work, what time she usually left her building, the color of the coat she had recently purchased. The letter ended with a single sentence. I have been watching you for 6 months, and I want you to know that I have decided not to hurt you. Carolyn brought the letter to the Albany Police Department. Detectives took it seriously. The letter was processed for fingerprints. None were found. Beyond Carolyn's own, the handwriting was analyzed. It was printed rather than cursive. Deliberately generic. Difficult to trace. The postmark traced back to a post office in a small town called Schoharie. Detectives visited, showed the envelope to the postal workers. No one recalled anything specific. Meanwhile, investigators began working through the details in the letter itself. The coffee shop. There was one coffee shop on Carolyn's route that she frequented. They reviewed security footage from the past 6 months. They identified regulars. They cross-referenced faces. The work was painstaking, took weeks, and then they found him, a man named Warren Griggs, age 47, who had been a regular at the coffee shop since late September of the previous year. Approximately the 6-month window referenced in the letter, he always sat facing the door. He was alone every time. He paid in cash. Griggs was brought in for questioning. He was cooperative. He was soft-spoken. He sat across from detectives with his hands folded on the table, and he answered every question in a measured, unhurried way. He admitted to writing the letter. He said he had been watching Carolyn because he found her, in his words, interesting. He said he had never intended to harm her. He said the letter was meant as a kind of conclusion, a way of closing the chapter. He was moving away. He explained he would no longer be in the area. He felt she deserved to know that whatever he'd been doing was over. He seemed genuinely confused by the investigator's reaction. He seemed to think he had done something considerate. Griggs was charged with aggravated harassment. He pled guilty and received 2 years probation. But here is the detail from this case that I cannot stop thinking about. During the investigation, detectives searched Griggs's apartment. They found, in a filing cabinet in his home office, folders, physical manila folders, organized alphabetically. There were 11 folders. Each folder contained handwritten notes, schedules, physical descriptions, observations, photographs taken from a distance, printed on standard paper. Carolyn Dietrich was in one of those folders. There were 10 others, 10 other people who had been watched, who had been studied, whose routines had been catalogued in neat, careful handwriting. None of the others had ever received a letter. Whether that means Griggs decided not to close those chapters, or whether he simply hadn't finished yet, no one knows. Story 7. Something in the Attic. The year 2020 was a year when millions of people around the world found themselves inside their homes more than they had ever been before. For many, this meant confronting their living spaces in new ways, noticing things they had previously walked past without seeing, hearing sounds they had previously been too busy to register. For a family in Spokane, Washington, this became a horror story. The family, the Whitfield family, I'll call them, as they've requested anonymity, had moved into their home in the summer of 2019. It was a two-story house built in the 1960s. Solid construction, good bones. As people say, they had 2 children, ages 9 and 12. The parents, I'll call them David and Naomi, first noticed the sounds in January of 2020, a kind of intermittent creaking from above the second-floor ceiling, a scraping sound, occasionally, that seemed to move from one side of the house to the other. They assumed it was raccoons. Raccoons in the attic is a common problem in the Pacific Northwest. David looked up the signs. Yes, he thought, that's probably it. He made a note to call pest control. Then the pandemic lockdowns began, and pest control became a lower priority. They were managing work from home, school from home, all of it simultaneously. The sounds in the attic were an annoyance, not a crisis. In April, their 12-year-old, a girl I'll call Maya, said something at dinner that made both parents go quiet. She said, "Did you see someone in the attic today?" Naomi asked what she meant. Maya said she had been in her bedroom, which was directly below the attic access hatch, and she had heard a sound directly overhead. She'd looked up, and she said the attic hatch, which was a simple panel in the ceiling, had moved, just slightly, just enough for a thin line of darkness to appear along one edge. David told her it was probably the raccoons. He said sometimes animals could move things like that if they were pushing against them. Maya looked at him for a moment. "But Dad," she said, "I heard breathing." David went up to the attic that evening. He had a flashlight and a hammer, which he held more for comfort than utility. He climbed the folding ladder and pushed open the hatch. He scanned the space with his flashlight. It was a standard attic. Insulation, ductwork, boxes they'd stored up there when they moved in, the beams of the roof structure running overhead, and something else. In the far corner, behind a stack of boxes, there was a space that had been cleared. A section of the insulation had been pushed aside, and in that cleared space, there was a sleeping bag. Not their sleeping bag. A sleeping bag they had never seen before. David described going very cold in that moment, very still. His flashlight was shaking. He swept the rest of the attic as fast as he could, convinced he was about to find someone crouching behind something. The attic was empty. Whoever had been there was not there right now. But they had been there. They had been there long enough to make themselves comfortable. Police were called. Officers examined the attic and confirmed the sleeping bag, along with a handful of other items: an empty plastic water bottle, a protein bar wrapper, and a small battery-powered LED lantern. They also found, in the dust of the attic floor, footprints. The attic, it turned out, had a secondary access point, a small vent panel on the exterior of the house, near the roofline, that had been compromised. The screws on the panel were stripped and the panel could be removed and replaced from the outside. Someone had been entering the home, sleeping in the attic, during a lockdown, while the entire family was home. The police estimated based on the evidence that the person had been accessing the attic for at least several weeks, possibly since February. The sleeping bag was tested. DNA was recovered. It matched a man who had been living without a fixed address in the Spokane area for several years. He had a history of trespassing charges. He was located 2 weeks after the discovery. Living rough near the river, he was charged and prosecuted. But what David said in a later interview, what has stayed with me, was this: the worst moment wasn't finding the sleeping bag. The worst moment was when I realized that we had been eating dinner together every night, right below that hatch, and that someone was up there, maybe 8 feet above us, listening. And we were laughing. We were just laughing and talking, like nothing was wrong. And they were right there. Story 8. The last voicemail. I want to tell this last story carefully, because it is, of all the stories I've shared tonight, perhaps the most quietly devastating. It does not involve a face at a window or a figure in the dark. It involves something much more ordinary. A phone call. In August of 2007, a woman named Patricia Okafor received a voicemail on her cell phone from a number she didn't recognize. She was 34 years old, living in Chicago's Wicker Park neighborhood. She worked as a graphic designer. She was, by all accounts, a warm, funny, deeply loved person. The voicemail was 11 seconds long. The caller was a man. His voice was calm and clear. He said, "This is just to let you know that I've been watching you for a long time, and I want you to understand that I mean you no harm." There was a pause. Then, "I just needed you to know that I exist." Patricia saved the voicemail and reported it to the police the same day. Detectives ran the number, came back to a prepaid phone, a burner, purchased with cash, no useful trace. Patricia was, understandably, frightened. She began varying her routines. She became hyper-aware of her surroundings. She told her friends and family what was happening. She did everything right. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. No more calls, no incidents, no sense of being followed. Patricia began to think it might have been a wrong number, a misdial, a prank. Then, on a Tuesday morning in September, she received a second voicemail from the same number. It was 4 words: "I still see you." Patricia called the police immediately. A detective was assigned to her case. Officers began doing periodic check-ins on her building. Her friends organized a kind of informal watch. Someone always knew where she was. The detective on the case was a man named Ray Okonkwo. He took this case seriously. He worked it hard. And 3 weeks later, Ray caught a break. The prepaid phone had been purchased at a convenience store in Patricia's neighborhood. The store had a camera. Ray obtained the footage. He had a face. The face belonged to a man named Terrence Hollis, age 39, who lived 4 blocks from Patricia. He had no criminal record. He was employed as a data entry clerk. He lived alone. When detectives went to Hollis's apartment, he opened the door immediately. He was cooperative. He was quiet. On his kitchen table, spread out in a careful arrangement, were printed photographs. They were all of Patricia, taken over what appeared to be months, getting coffee, walking her usual route, sitting on her building's front steps. There were also handwritten letters, dozens of them, never sent, all addressed to Patricia by name. In them, Hollis described, in earnest and detailed language, his belief that he and Patricia had a deep connection, that she was aware of him on some level, that they were, in some spiritual sense, already linked. He was arrested. He was charged. He was prosecuted. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. with a restraining order upon release. During the sentencing hearing, the judge asked Hollis if he had anything to say. Hollis looked at Patricia, who was present in the courtroom. He said, "I never wanted to scare you." He paused. "I just wanted to be real to you." Patricia read her victim impact statement in a clear, steady voice. She described the 11 months between the first voicemail and the sentencing, the way she had stopped walking her usual routes, the way she had stopped trusting her own sense of safety, the way she now checked her surroundings constantly in restaurants, in stores, on the street. She described what it felt like to know that someone had been watching her and she hadn't known, to look back on her ordinary days, her coffee trips, her walks, her quiet moments on the front steps, and understand that none of them had ever been entirely private. She described what it felt like to have been chosen. She said, "You wanted to be real to me. I want you to understand something. You made me afraid of the world. That's the most real thing about you." 8 stories, 8 real accounts, 8 sets of people who woke up one day to find that the boundary between their ordinary life and something deeply wrong had been quietly, patiently dissolved. The thing that connects all of these stories, the thread that runs through all of them, is this: none of these people thought it would happen to them. They were not people in movies who ignored obvious warning signs. They were not careless. They were not foolish. They were exactly like you, exactly like me, people living their lives, making coffee, taking photographs, sleeping in beds they believed were safe. True horror does not announce itself. It moves quietly. It is patient. It learns your schedule. It stands just outside the edge of your vision and waits. And the bravery of every person in these stories, every Emily, every Diane, every Carolyn, every Patricia, lies not in what they did after the horror found them, but in the fact that they kept going, that they got up the next day, that they told their stories so that others might be more careful, more aware, more able to trust the quiet voice inside themselves that says, "Something is wrong. Trust that voice." I'll see you in the next collection. This has been The Scary Collector. Stay safe.